author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
President Joe Biden faces uncomfortable challenges from both within and outside of his party in the upcoming presidential election in 2024. And the nation begins to feel the heat build for that particular election. All this and more in today's edition of Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. As the president plays a dangerous game of chicken with both New Hampshire and Iowa regarding who gets to be the first in the nation to hold their primary or caucus, we have to wonder just how much damage it will do to his reputation to back down at this late stage. Also on today's show, what perils lie ahead of No Labels and Cornel West and their third-party challenges. We'll also be looking at how Donald Trump is bearing up under the weight of multiple indictments and even exposed the latest hidden numbers in the job report. What aren't you being told by the talking heads in the White House? The nation is possibly more divided than at any time in recent history, and yet the political games must continue as they have done since the beginning. Now, I want to take a brief moment to say a special thank you to our listeners out in Hastings, Michigan on WBCH 1220 AM and 93.1 FM. Thank you for being here. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access breaking news, analysis, top stories, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. Let's get started. A careless bluff or a desperate need to get the primary votes in early? Well, this is the conundrum facing President Joe Biden. And what is a commander-in-chief to do? Well, we're fortunate to be joined by Liberty Nation's senior political analyst and longtime host of this here radio show, Mr. Tim Donner, to figure that out. Thanks for being here, Tim.
Okay, a pleasure, Mark.
So, Tim, New Hampshire does not want to play ball with President Biden when it comes to the Democrat presidential primary. Could you give us a brief rundown of what's been happening and what the latest situation is, please?
Well, the current state of play is what I would describe as a stare down, because for more than 100 years, New Hampshire has always been the first primary. It's famously the first primary. And Iowa's the first caucus that goes about a week before. So Iowa and New Hampshire were 1 and 2 over the long march of political history over the last century. But especially since South Carolina turned out to be his resurrection place in 2020, Joe Biden decided to reward them by making them the first primary on the schedule for 2024, breaking a long tradition. And of course, it's 2020 when Jim Clyburn stepped in, the most powerful politician in the state, and was willing to endorse Biden. He won that primary. The party ran all the other moderate candidates off and handed the nomination to Biden. So fast forward to 2023, and I guess Biden and the Democratic National Party felt like Iowa and New Hampshire would just bend to their will and say, okay, sure, we'll go after South Carolina. But both those states say not so fast, because New Hampshire, by state law, is required to hold its primary a week before any other similar contest, which means they would be breaking their own state law if they didn't go before South Carolina, right? So it's a stare down now with New Hampshire saying, we're not going to back down. And if it means running our first in the nation primary without Joe Biden on the ballot, then so be it. And someone like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. can step in and get himself a most unexpected victory. And it's the same thing in Iowa, where they expect to be the very first contest in the nation, and they're not backing down either. So I wrote about this months ago on LibertyNation.com that really this could be a tremendous embarrassment for Joe Biden, because either way you cut it, he's in trouble, because he's in trouble if he loses New Hampshire and Iowa, and he's in trouble if he backs down from his pledge to make South Carolina first. So it's a heads, he loses, tails, he loses kind of proposition.
Yeah, it's a big credibility problem, isn't it? So the fact is, the way you put it, you said that he wants to reward South Carolina. I don't quite see it as it's a reward. It's not like petting South Carolina on the head and saying, you're a good state, you got me to office. I think it's where he can reliably get out of the gate with some primary wins. I think that's the key thing to it. But obviously, he's going to win in pretty much every state anyway in the primaries. But he can get a nice solid one. Say, look, it's the black people in in South Carolina that are supporting me, and try and replicate that noise around the country.
Well, I suppose so. But, as a sitting president with about a 60-point lead, or 40 or 50, whatever it is, it's not really a contest.
Sure.
Joe Biden is not in a position to have to kind of posture politically. I do agree that South Carolina is far more representative of the Democratic coalition, which means there's far more minorities than there are in Iowa and New Hampshire, which are extremely white states, right? So they're not representative really of the country as a whole, or especially of sort of the winning Democratic coalition for November, which is more focused on coastal states and, urban environments to generate votes.
So I'm wondering, Joe Biden, he took New Hampshire in 2020 by, I think it was almost 7 points. And it was more than 7 points for the candidates in 2022 for the Senate and House race. So even if New Hampshire were the New Hampshireites, I'm not sure what they're called, the New Hampshireites and Iowites were particularly Iowans. I knew that one. If they were particularly peeved at Joe Biden's apparent snubbing, I don't think it would make a major difference to the electoral college numbers anyway, would it? Or am I missing?
No, I don't think so. It would be really nothing more than a rank political embarrassment for Biden. So, he may feel like he should stick to going South Carolina first, but by the time he gets there, under the current scenario, he's going to be wounded in the court of public opinion for losing the first two contests to someone in Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's desperate for some sort of hint of credibility or mainstream interest. And he will get it if he wins in Iowa and New Hampshire.
So what we're looking at is Biden will take a hit that, while it won't affect him in New Hampshire or Iowa, could affect him come 2024 in other areas, because he's been made to look as though he's lost credibility by having somebody like RFK.
I think to some degree, but like so many other things in this election, Mark, this is uncharted territory. We don't know what happens when a president refuses to enter a primary. I mean, Lyndon Johnson probably wished he had in 1968, because it was a New Hampshire primary. That was his downfall. He actually lost it. But his showing was so unimpressive that he was convinced to drop out of the race. And of course he did, and the rest is history. He became a one-term president. Joe Biden wants to avoid that.
That is a path to be avoided if he can. We'll be back with Tim Donner after this short break, talking the no labels threat. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back here on Liberty Nation Radio with a longtime host of this here show, Mr. Tim Donner. Now, earlier in the show, we discussed the New Hampshire and Iowa issue for the primaries, but now I want to talk about the general election coming up in 2024, Tim, and specifically the threat posed by third-party contenders. Now, Tim, you wrote an article this week on the threat posed by no labels. Would you care to give us a brief encapsulation of how you see the situation with a third party?
Okay, so the no labels movement was begun about 15 years ago to provide an alternative to the increasingly hardcore views of both parties, shall we say, with the Republican Party having headed to the right, the Democratic Party to the left, especially during the Obama years. The party grew in size and stature, but mostly as just sort of some kind of antidote to the political partisanship of the 21st century. But this year, it's a serious thing because we see that between 2/3 and 3/4 of the country don't want either Donald Trump or Joe Biden on the ballot. They'll probably vote for one of them, but they don't want them on the ballot. So there is an appetite in this balkanized political environment, which is more divided than any of us have seen in our lifetimes, I think. The feeling is there's an appetite for a moderate centrist as an alternative to both Trump and Biden, and that's where no labels comes in. The party's now been taken over by three fairly prominent conservative Democrats or liberal Republicans, specifically Joe Manchin, who, of course, has made his reputation as the slayer of left-wing legislation in the United States Senate, the scorn of the Democratic establishment and the Democratic left. Now, he's also, having been an outcast from his party, he's also way behind in his potential race for another term in the Senate.
That's against Jim Justice, isn't it? I think he's at least 15 to 20 points behind there.
Well, it's in double digits, so it's not looking good for Joe Manchin. So the way for him to keep his the centrality of his presence, as it has been since Joe Biden became president, Joe Manchin has been a crucial swing figure in the nation. And by running as an independent, effectively, candidate, he can stay in a position of tremendous influence and probably take a lot more votes away from Joe Biden than from Donald Trump. And let me tell you something, Mark, they are terrified about the no labels movement in the Democratic Party because they're now on the ballot in 10 states. And that's no small feat. You don't just send it in the name of your party and say, put us on the ballot. It costs millions and millions of dollars. And they've got ballot access in 10 states, including 3 critical swing states. One of them is Arizona, which, of course, has become a crucial battleground. So you have to believe, given the millions of dollars that they have spent on ballot access, that even though party officials from the No Labels Party say they're only going to put forward a ticket for president if it's clear they can win and not just be a spoiler, you've got to think they're going to put a ticket forward. And if they do, it's going to be big trouble for a Democratic Party that's already concerned about the 2, 3, 4% that's likely to be drawn by far left candidate Cornel West running on the Green Party ticket. He could be the Ralph Nader of 2024 by siphoning votes away from Democrats.
Or the Jill Stein of 2016.
Yes, or the Jill Stein of 2016. This is a recurring nightmare for the Democrats, because Ralph Nader in 2000 And of course, Jill Stein in 2016, both those third-party candidacies likely cost Al Gore and Hillary Clinton the presidency by their very presence on the ballot. And so this is a serious threat. And I don't know what they can do about it, because at one time they say they accuse Donald Trump of trying to destroy democracy, and yet they are spending a ton of money, the Democratic Party, to try and keep the No Labels Party off the ballot while still trying to claim that they are most interested in democracy. That's a hard case to make, Mark.
It reminds me, in China, they obviously China really, the nation with its governance, it doesn't really fit any particular label other than its own, and so they call it communism, but Chinese style, or they call it the act of doing business. They call it capitalism, but Chinese style. And so for this, it's Democrats. It's democracy, but Democrat style.
It's our kind of democracy.
It's our kind of democracy. So let's dig into this Cornel West thing. So I really find that so fascinating. I can envision no labels, despite being on the ballot in 10 states already. I can envision them pulling out if it really does look like they're going to sink Joe Biden. I can see them pulling out. I know it's not a popular view, but I think that could happen. But I can't see Cornel West pulling out. And we were looking at you and I were looking at the three recent polls that did head-to-head with Trump, Biden, and Mr. West. And in all three of those polls, Donald Trump is the clear leader. And I think that's because Cornel West is very much on the political left. He's a progressive socialist. He's Bernie Sanders, but with university chops, I think, is the right way to look at it.
Professor Cornel West. I think he has professed at like every major Ivy League university from Princeton to Harvard. Yes, he's not going to draw any votes away from Trump, only from Biden. Now, to your point that you think no labels will probably pull out if it's going to cost Biden the election, well, not if you believe Democrat conspiracy theorists. And it's more than just conspiracy, that the no labels movement is being funded by the Republican Party in order specifically to carve up the Democratic vote. And it would make sense, wouldn't it? We know that some people who've supported Trump in the past are among those who have contributed to the No Labels Party. Democrats are trying to get full disclosure of the contributions that are made from this, very highly funded organization, No Labels. And they haven't succeeded in it so far.
We actually saw something similar, didn't we, in 2020, where the political left was backing what they considered the more extreme candidates on the right because they figured they could never win in a general election. Tim, thank you ever so much, Mr. Tim Donner. Thanks for being here. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Mark. Always a pleasure.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
We've talked no labels. We've talked New Hampshire and Iowa. But now I want to talk the 2024 election, the real deal. And we were lucky to be joined once again by a longtime host of this here show and Liberty Nation's senior political analyst, Mr. Tim Donner. Thanks for coming back in, Tim. And now, you're really the person to go to on this because you understand the electoral math pretty much better than anybody, as far as I'm concerned, Tim. How do you see the campaigns moving as we get closer to 2024? Do you see Donald Trump continuing to build strength, which I believe he is, and Joe Biden continuing to weaken, which it certainly appears that that's what's happening? Or have I got my analysis wrong?
Well, that's what's happened to this point, but what we cannot predict, because it was up to this point in history unthinkable that a major party nominee for president would be arrested and then arrested again and again and again. Now, what that has done, of course, is accrue a great deal of support to Trump in the person of people who don't necessarily want him to run for president, don't even support him, particularly compared to other candidates who are, upset about the way things ended in 2020 and into 2021 and January 6th and all that. But when their guy, it's one thing for them to oppose their own guy. It's another thing when that opposition comes externally. And so it's almost like a challenge to those kind of voters to step up and support Trump on principle, right? Now, how far does that principle go, though, once we see? I mean, he has certainly survived and actually thrived from the first mugshot ever taken of a sitting president. Okay, but can he survive if we keep seeing him in court time after time after time when the entire campaign is effectively one legal entanglement after another? Issues aren't going to get discussed. It's only a matter, really, ultimately, Mark, I think it comes down to, with apologies for sounding so stark, the voters will decide whether Donald Trump should go to the White House or go to prison. Because if he doesn't win, he will certainly go to prison, perhaps for the rest of his life. If he does win, it's impossible to envision him going to prison. So essentially, I think for all the juries that will make decisions about Donald Trump at federal and state levels over the coming months, I think it's ultimately the voters who are the jury here to decide are the transgressions of Donald Trump so great that we can't possibly have a president like that? Or is the fact that the naked, attacks, political attacks using the legal system, using police force to take out a major party candidate, whether that's just one toke over the line, as the old song says, and whether people will say, this is really a danger to democracy when a party can arrest its political enemies, and we're moving into banana republic territory.
Yeah, it's something that our legal affairs editor, Scott D. Cosenza, host of the Uprising podcast, often says, that every decision to prosecute is political. It's not as though Trump ran somebody over in his car and then tried to get away with it. It's not as though he, as he often boasts, he could get away with, walked down Fifth Avenue and shot somebody. These are all crimes that he's being charged with.
I believe, just to correct the record, that he said he could fire a shot. I don't think he said he could shoot a person. Just, I don't.
My apologies, Mr. Trump. My apologies. But yes, but the crimes with which he's charged, I believe it's 91 separate indictments. I think a lot of people are having, a lot of the voting public are having difficulty understanding, wait, what is the crime? What is the actual crime? Because so many of them are novel charges that nobody's ever been charged with before. And I mean, we won't get too much into it.
That's really the bottom line right there. When a person multiple times is charged with crimes based on laws that have never been applied before, that's a definition of political harassment, persecution, and election interference. This is what this is. This is election interference. The very thing, of course, that they tried to pin on Trump in 2016. And then, of course, again in 2020, just because it's Trump, they have to say that.
Yeah, that 2016, how did that work out for them again? The Russia hoax, as it's now well
look, they're playing the same cards here, Mark.
It really
they're
is.
Saying there's a lot of similarities because once again, they've determined that Donald Trump is so beatable that they're going to try and tempt Republicans to nominate him, knowing for sure that all Joe Biden has to do is run tapes of January 6th on a loop and people will be scared off and vote for Joe Biden again. Now, as you say, how'd that work out in 2016, where Democrats were celebrating the nomination of Donald Trump because they said, well, of course, we're going to beat him.
Yeah.
And we all know how that went. They're playing the same game again, and they're playing with fire. We'll see if they get burned, because if they do, it's going to be a political fire akin to what just happened in Maui.
Yeah, the thing is, it doesn't actually, I do get your point, but it doesn't have to be a grand conflagration. I got these words wrong. It doesn't have to be a conflagration. But if there is even just a minor pushback against people, against what's happening to Donald Trump, rightly or wrongly, if people can't understand it, why he's being prosecuted on these crimes that are so hard to explain in even a 5-minute soundbite that they might get on CNN, there only has to be a minor pushback for this to flip the entire country. You got Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and if there's a few thousand voters in those states who think that Donald Trump has been treated poorly by a government that appears to be politically prosecuting its chief opponent, and it's just a few thousand votes in each of those states. I think
it's an understatement to say treated poorly when what they really are proposing to do is to throw him in prison for the rest of his life and throw away the key. Right? It's the intensity and the obvious naked partisanship in using police force, the power of the state, to essentially to prohibit the voters from having a chance to vote for someone they have said repeatedly that they want to vote for. Right.
Yeah, so keep Donald Trump off the ballot. They're also attempting to keep no labels off the ballot, as we discussed earlier in the show. It seems that certain presidents don't want to actually run against anybody. Tim.
Well, I don't know if they're trying to keep Trump off the ballot so much as to put him on the ballot as a thoroughly discredited individual, right? Because they think they can beat him. I think they have figured from the beginning they couldn't beat any other legitimate Republican contender, i.e. Ron DeSantis, Nikki Haley, Tim Scott, and the like, that Trump was the one they could beat, and the only way they could beat him was to encourage his nomination, which they certainly have done by using the law to arrest their political enemy repeatedly. It's a dark, dark time in American political history, Mark. It really is. When we reach the point where one party, the ruling party, arrests the leader of its opposition.
Yeah, Joe Biden promised us a dark winter, and he certainly delivered on that promise.
He did deliver on that promise. True.
Tim Donner, thank you ever so much.
Pleasure, Mark.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Fresh off touting Bidenomics and the Biden job growth, President Biden had some unexpected figures in the latest jobs report. Now, to tell us all the details and figure out why this isn't looking good for America, we're joined by Liberty Nation's economics editor, Mr. Andrew Moran, who joins us here today. Thanks for being here, Andrew.
Thank you for having me.
So first off, give us a rundown of what the latest jobs report said, or that, in fact, even better, tell us what it was expected to say and then what it said.
Well, it was expected to be just another sign that the U.S. labor market is slowing down, and the report did show that. The headline figure was 187,000 new jobs in August. I think the consensus estimate was about 170, so it came in slightly better. But overall, when you dive deeper into the numbers, it was not a healthy jobs report at all. I mean, the unemployment rate ticked up to 3.8%, but there's a lot more under the hood that should be a cause for concern. One of the most notable components of that non-farm payroll report were the revisions. It was a revision report, because this represented the eighth every month so far this year. The jobs report has been revised. So in total, from January to July, there have been 355,000 revisions to the jobs report. So that's about roughly.
I got to interrupt there, Andrew. Why do they keep overestimating what the numbers will be, even month after month, when they keep having to revise it? Why do they keep? Is it the eternal sunshine of the spotless mind? Is it desperate optimism that every month? Is it because it seems to me it's Charlie Brown and Lucy with the football?
Well, the official word from Bureau of Labor Statistics is that all the jobs report is based on a couple of surveys. So as time goes by, they get more data coming from these establishment household surveys, and then that's how they come to the conclusion of revisions. The problem with these revisions is that it's been extended for too long. So outside of recessions, there hasn't been 6 consecutive months of revisions since the 2007 housing market collapse.
Notably, you said 2008. You said 2007 because that's when the revisions took place, right? And then along came 2008.
Yeah, exactly. And so it has a lot of people scratching their heads of how government extracts the data, how it compiles, and how it puts together. Because it's not only the jobs report that's been revised; the latest GDP was also revised downward. So is it cautious optimism? Is it overestimating? I can't say exactly. There's no official word from BLS, but it raises some eyebrows of how you can constantly have this size and frequency of revisions in the jobs reports.
You mentioned that the unemployment rate reached 3.8%. Now, what does that mean? Because there's also the non-employment rate as well. I'm not sure what that figure is, but that's the people who were looking for work but have just decided this isn't working out. Are they included in that?
Well, I think you're referring to the U6 unemployment rate, which actually went up to 7.1%.
Yeah.
That's the people who are working part-time but wish to work full-time, or people who are long-term unemployed. So that number actually jumped. Now, the 3.8% number, the reason why it went up and why there was still at the same time an increase in jobs was because more people returned to the workforce or are just starting to enter the workforce. And why is that happening? Well, if you look at the San Francisco Fed report saying that, pandemic-era savings are going to be exhausted soon by the end of the year at the latest, then people are running out of money, so they have to get jobs. Credit card debt reached $1 trillion in the second quarter. So and of course, inflation is still elevated, cost of living is sky high. So a lot of people are being forced to go back to work. But if you look deeper into the numbers too, you see the number of people working 2 or more jobs has remained above 8 million. Before Biden, it was around 4 million, so doubled under his watch.
I remember very, very clearly during the last presidency, the Trump presidency, and AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, New York Congresswoman, was on television railing that people are working 2 jobs. And she was saying how bad this was. And she was essentially saying what you and I have been saying for the last few weeks. It's hiding. When people need to have 2 jobs, sure, there's some people do it out of choice, but very few people choose to work their life away, pushing 2 jobs as just an option of free will. And she was railing against it. But she's quiet now. I'm hearing not a peep from Miss Ocasio-Cortez on the double dipping and triple dipping of jobs, which surprises me. Why do you think that is?
Okay, well, so 3 things. First, AOC was one who said that the reason why there are all these riots happening all over the U.S. is because why people are shoplifting is because they need bread. So it's Les Miserables all over the whole.
Although I will point out, not that many bakers were actually robbed, unless people are planning on trading. I don't know what these shoes are. Nike Air shoes for a French baguette or something. Right, please. What was your number 2?
Okay, so number 2 is that if you look at the difference between the household and the establishment survey, that shows exactly what's going on in the economy, whereby the establishment survey counts every single job one person has, that's added to the payroll. You look at the household number, you see the divergence yet again, because they only count for how many jobs.
Yes, so just to clarify that, the former counts each individual job, and the latter just counts each employed person, right?
Exactly. Yes. So
Right.
so that's why I don't take much stock into the establishment survey because, to tie into your previous point, perhaps it overestimates the current labor market situation. And then finally, one important point that I've been writing about for the last a few months, and I wrote about heavily during the Obama years, before, of course, Liberty Nation, was the prevalence of part-time jobs. Now, if you look over the last 2 months, there's been a decline of 600,000 full-time jobs. But at the same time, there's been a little more than 1 million new part-time jobs in that same span. So is the United States turning into a part-time jobs nation as it was during the Obama years? That waits to be seen. So I think those are some important numbers to monitor over the next few jobs reports, revisions, part-time jobs numbers. And for a lot of people who are also concerned about, legal immigration and, the amount of foreigners working U.S. jobs, the number of native-born workers has declined, but the native foreign-born workers having jobs has increased. So I think that's also, for me, those things don't matter, but for other people, that's also something to watch.
Yeah, it's American jobs for Americans. That's gone out the window a long time ago, I think, of that, unfortunately. So let's get back to this idea of part-time jobs, Andrew, because I really want to look at this not so much from an economist point of view, but a real-world affliction point of view. So with part-time jobs, we're assuming, and probably rightly, that these jobs pay less than a full-time job, right? So it's not as though they're doing half the amount of hours for twice the amount of money, right?
Oh, yeah, you're absolutely correct.
Yeah, they're earning less. So essentially, although the jobs numbers, if you just count a job as a job, whether it's part-time or full-time, it looks like things are really getting good. And that appears to be the headline that the administration is peddling to everybody. Look how good things are. Look at all these jobs. But in reality, what's happening is there are more people who are poorer than there were before. Is that a fair assumption? Or who are having less income than before?
Well, yeah. I mean, yeah, of course that's going to happen. But I think the real story behind the rise in part-time jobs, if you look through history, and regional central banks economists have studied this issue too, is that typically heading into a recession or just coming out of an economic downturn, you see an increase in part-time jobs. Now, one of the things that happens either heading into a recession or just slightly coming out of one is that companies trim their full-time workers because they're trying to rein in costs, trying to keep, some people having jobs, things like that. So I think it was the San Francisco Fed that looked into this, and they did see a correlation between economic downturn and the rise of part-time jobs. Another thing too, if you want to talk about part-time jobs, within that Bureau of Labor Statistics report is that the number of temp jobs has actually declined. Now, typically during an economic boom period, you see an increase in temp jobs because companies want to have more workers. But as the economy slows, one of the first people they ditch are temp workers. So I think that's another component of this jobs report that not a lot of people are talking about. So this all ties into the larger point that headline figure always generates all the attention. Like Joe Biden, he had a victory lap the other day, which was more like his 2-second jog. Half job he does, and he looked at me number and started touting, Bidenomics, but all under the hood, the labor market is cooling down, and there are a lot of hiccups that are going to be amplified in the coming months.
Joe Biden's economic Stingray 67 Corvette is in fact a Flintstones car by the looks of it. Andrew Moran, thanks ever so much for joining us. Much appreciated.
Thank you for having me.
And that's about all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America network. As always, I'd like to take a brief moment to thank our guests, longtime host of this here show, Mr. Tim Donner, and economics analyst Andrew Moran, and of course, extend my thanks to you out there, the listeners, for taking the time to tune in. And my parting shot for this week, I'll leave you with the words of Winston Churchill, who said, quote, "It's a fine game to play, the game of politics, and it's well worth waiting for a good hand before really plunging," end quote. Now, I wonder who holds all the cards in the next upcoming presidential election. Thanks for listening. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Don't get caught up in the media madness. Join our movement for free thinking and free speech at libertynation.com. Publishing news and analysis 24/7 with original articles by our team of authors who tell it like it is. Join us each week for online TV shows, The Uprising Podcast, and Liberty Nation Radio. We believe in free thinking and free speech. We are LibertyNation.com.